those of you who are habitués of the library will know I'm John Foster. I'm a reference librarian here at Manor Public Library. I have a doctorate in history from the University of Washington. My doctorate is in European history, so I've been trying to do lectures on American history because I feel like I failed somehow. But it's really been, it's actually, I think, a good exercise. It's a really good exercise to go ahead and read the Constitution, because it's a really fascinating document, and also the one on which the country is notionally run. But also, I mean, it's just really interesting to see sort of like this is the nuts and bolts of what American government is meant to be about. So this is the final lecture in this year's series on the origins of the U.S. Constitution, and I did it in a little bit of a weird way. I started out with the English Civil War, which is the origin of a lot of the kind of value propositions that then sort of emerge in the Constitution of 1787 and in the Revolutionary period in the United States. I then did the Constitutional Convention. We talked about subsequently the Federalist Papers. And then I thought, it might be interesting to do the Civil War amendments because, as will become evident in the course of this talk, they're extremely influential in terms of what's gone on in the United States to this point. And I asked and was very, very enthused to get agreement from Todd Arrington, who also has a PhD, which I forgot to mention on the thing. He's also the head ranger over at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site, which is really a luxury for us here at the library to have the Garfield Historic Site like down the block, because they're just a great resource for stuff. They do programs here, which I know many of you attend. But so, before I start for real, so this is what's going to happen here. I'm going to finish up this introduction in the next couple of minutes, and then Todd is going to start with his bit in which he's going to sort of talk about the kind of background, and then I'm going to talk about sort of going forward. But I just wanted to throw out this question. Todd already sort of knows my answer, so he can't really contribute here. But so my question for you, as most or all of you are Ohioans, like who is the most influential Ohioan in terms of shaping the history of the United States, right? Okay, so obvious answer, right? Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant smashed the Confederacy militarily, subsequently became president, also wrote a fabulous set of memoirs at the very end of his life. It's some of the best memoir writing that's ever been done. I mean, he really only was expert level at two things, and one of them was being a general, and the other was writing. But as a matter of fact, I love Ulysses S. Grant because he kind of understood his own limitations. There's that famous story about, like, he said he only knew two songs. One of them was Yankee Doodle, and the other one wasn't. But a sort of dark horse candidate, I think, for most influential Ohioan would be John Armour Bingham. Has anyone here ever heard of John Armour Bingham? Probably not. Until 2 weeks ago, I hadn't either. John Armour Bingham was, technically he was born in Pennsylvania, but he came to Ohio at a fairly young age. He went to law school. He was a district attorney in the county that's just south of Canton, the name of which I can never quite remember, but it's in the presentation, so I'll get it right. Then he was a U.S. representative from a district that still exists today. At one point his district was reapportioned, but it's basically a district that goes from sort of like the west side of Cleveland down toward Canton, excluding Akron. He lost his seat in the middle of the Civil War, 1863, to a peace Democrat, because at that point, soldiers serving in the Army were not allowed to vote by mail in Ohio. So Lincoln made him the Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Army, and then in 1865, when soldiers were allowed to vote by mail, he won his seat again in Ohio. But he had some other notable experiences, which I'll talk about when it comes to it. But he was the guy who actually wrote the text of the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is, without a doubt, I mean, I try not to make too many sort of flat, unequivocal statements, but the 14th Amendment is, without a doubt, the most influential piece of constitutional legislation in the 200-year history of this country, 200 plus year, with the exception of the Constitution of 1787 itself and the Bill of Rights. So probably it's number 3. But if you want to talk about what's happening in the 20th century, or since 1866, the 14th Amendment is of crucial importance. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Todd to do his thing, and then I will return when he's done.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Thanks. Yes, as you heard, I'm Todd Arrington. I'm the site manager at James A. Garfield National Historic Site. I am contractually obligated to say that when John asked who's the most influential Ohioan of all time, of course I said James A. Garfield, even though I knew that was probably not the right answer, but I did try to work that in. So thank you, John, for having me here tonight. Thanks all of you for coming on a Thursday night when you probably could have been home watching football or the news or whatever you like to watch. This presentation will be only 5 or 6 hours, and then at the end of that, we'll be happy to take any questions you have, and we'll have everybody home and in bed by about 4 a.m. So,
there will be a short exam.
Yes, yes, and an hour-long intermission as well. Right. So Jason will be selling popcorn, and it'll be a great time. So. Yeah, so the Reconstruction Amendments, as John said, obviously very critical. We're clearly talking about things that happened post-Civil War. These are the pieces of legislation, or the amendments to the Constitution, rather, that came out of the Civil War and really tried to solve the issues that brought the Civil War about. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. And as John indicated, and he will talk about, the 14th Amendment really is clearly, of the three, probably arguably the most important, and the one that we are still hearing about and still talking about with some of the issues going on in the country even today. And I mean literally things going on in the country today. So there are still implications from the 14th Amendment. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the background of the Civil War and try to give you a little bit of context on some of these issues that the war was, that brought the war about and that necessitated the eventual creation of these three amendments. And then when I basically, kind of get us to the war, then I'll kind of, or get us to the end of the war, I'll turn it over to John and let him talk about the amendments themselves. And then John, however you normally like to deal with questions, if you like to take them in the middle or at the end, whatever you like to do, I'm game. So, okay, so back to Doonesbury. Anybody need Doonesbury again, or? That was pretty good, actually. So, before we talk about the Constitution, of course, we have to talk about the Declaration of Independence. Everybody knows the most famous passage from the Declaration of Independence, of course. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is significant for many, many reasons. First of all, the question that we have to ask ourselves, who exactly is included in all men who are created equal? Now, if you're asking that question in 2022, the answer that we would all come up with is obviously, I hope, very different than probably what was in the minds of most people in 1776. Certainly all men in 1776, from a legal perspective at least, was white male property owners. Women were not included. Certainly enslaved black people were not included. Basically anybody, displaced American Indians were not included. So there was a fairly limited definition of all men at this point. So that's one reason that this is very significant. Obviously, that you can see where this is leading as we lead up to the Civil War. The other reason that this is very significant is that, I kind of made the joke about the Gettysburg Address, but when Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, he started it 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So Lincoln was dating the beginning of the country, not from the Constitution, but from the Declaration of Independence. Not from 1787, but from 1776. That is significant. Because later in that same speech, and of course when you're talking about the Gettysburg Address, later is about 60 or 70 seconds later, because it's such a short address, he says that the country needs a new birth of freedom so that indeed everyone is included in all men are created equal. We get to the Constitution in 1787. As John said, the Articles of Confederation come first. There's clearly by 1787 a need to, at least initially, a belief that those articles need to be revised and strengthened, and then shortly thereafter a realization that maybe we ought to just create something newer and better that is, as John said, certainly an expansion of federal power. Slavery is obviously part of the country at this point. So the question is, that takes us up to the Civil War at least, was the Constitution a pro or an anti-slavery document? What does the Constitution say about the existence of slavery in the United States? What is the government's position on the existence of slavery in the United States? And to help us answer that question, I'll ask you another question. How many times, if you know, does the word slavery appear in the United States Constitution? In 1787, at least as initially written. How many times? Zero. 0 times. So, was the Constitution pro or anti-slavery?
Neutral. Yes.
Neutral. Yes.
Yes. That's always a good answer.
Yes. The answer is yes. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. That is the 3/5 compromise. That is saying that 3/5 of enslaved people, basically, will be counted for the purposes of population to apportion seats in the House of Representatives. So even though the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution at the very least acknowledges the existence of slavery and doesn't do anything about it. You want to say it's pro or anti-slavery, I guess you could argue that either way. To my mind, this makes it a pro-slavery document, or at the very least, a document that acknowledges that it exists and does nothing about it. But what is the greatest thing about the Constitution? Of all the wonderful things about the Constitution, what is the best thing about it? In my mind, at least, you can change it. It is a living, breathing document. The Founding Fathers, who, by the way, many of whom were slave owners, we know this, many of whom worried about what the institution of slavery would do to the country. Washington, Jefferson, many of these guys tried, or at least proposed, ideas to try to get rid of slavery, and they just finally admitted they could not do it and still get this document passed. So they were going to have to leave it to a future generation to figure out, which obviously did happen at the cost of 720,000 American lives, but it did eventually happen. So the greatest thing about the Constitution is the acknowledgement that it is not perfect, it is a living document, and it can be changed. And this is the language right here from Article 5 that says it can be changed. We can amend it. We can acknowledge that something written in 1787 is not perfect for the year 2022. And we can change it. So, and obviously that speaks to the amendment process that we're going to be talking about here with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. What about property rights? The idea of private property is obviously sacred in the United States. And that is also something that Southerners used to justify, or I shouldn't say, it wasn't just Southerners at this early point in American history. That is something that slave owners used to justify the continued enslavement of Africans in the United States. No person, this is the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution that talks about private property. No one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So here we have the enshrinement of private property, but we also have the seeds of a movement that a lot of people thought maybe was a way to get rid of slavery later on, which was emancipate slaves and compensate slave owners, pay them for the freedom of their slaves. So that's where some of that language came from. But property rights are enshrined in the Constitution, and this is something that was used by many people to justify the existence of slavery and to say enslaved people are property, and private property is permitted under the Constitution. So here we have early, and obviously I'm making some very large leaps in time here, I realize, but we do only have those 5 hours, so we need to, we can't get through every single thing we need to talk about. So this is Abraham Lincoln, and this is 1858. So this is while he's running for the Senate in Illinois. He runs against Stephen A. Douglas. He loses that Senate seat, but he gains something probably more valuable than a seat in the Senate, which is national exposure as a very articulate voice against the expansion of slavery into the territories. That, of course, is what is able to fuel his run for the presidency 2 years later. But this is where he really starts to lay out what his objections to slavery are. Lincoln is not an abolitionist at this point. Lincoln is a guy who personally detests slavery and has said so as far back as the 1830s. He said as far back as the 1830s that he believed slavery was founded on injustice and bad policy. And he said at one point, just as I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. So Lincoln personally detested slavery, but he did not see a legal constitutional way to abolish slavery in the places where it already existed. In the states that were already states when the Constitution was ratified, slavery is legal. As much as you might hate it, slavery is legal. How do we go in there and get rid of it? However, in places that are now becoming American territories, that are federal lands now, it is legal to say slavery cannot come here. So this is Lincoln's sort of breaking point here. This is the thing that really brings Lincoln back into politics in the 1850s after he had been out of politics for a while. And so this is a speech he gave in 1858 while he was running for the Senate, or may have even been during one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I've made it equally plain that I think the Negro is included in the word men used in the Declaration of Independence. Remember, that's the Declaration of Independence from 1776 that he refers to in the Gettysburg Address several years later. I believe the declaration that all men are created equal is the great fundamental principle upon which our free institutions rest. That Negro slavery is violative of that principle, but that by our frame of government, that principle has not been made one of legal obligation. That by our frame of government, the states which have slavery are to retain it or to surrender it at their own pleasure, and that all others, individuals, free states, and national government are constitutionally bound to leave them alone about it. I believe our government was thus framed because of the necessity springing from the actual presence of slavery when it was framed. That such necessity does not exist in the territories where slavery is not present. It does not follow that social and political equality between whites and blacks must be incorporated because slavery must not. So again, Lincoln is not an abolitionist. He personally detests slavery. He does not at this point believe that white and black people are equal to one another. He buys into, for many years, the idea that blacks may have a better future if they are colonized outside the United States. But he is not in favor of the expansion of slavery. This is the thing that really necessitated the creation of the Republican Party in 1854. The Republican Party was not created as a party of abolitionists. It was created as a party of people opposed to the expansion of slavery. There were abolitionists in the party. Certainly there were, but they were the minority. Abraham Lincoln did not become an abolitionist until he was president of the United States. Here, of course, is, Lincoln, as I said, ran for president in 1860, just a flag there advertising Lincoln for president. Interestingly enough, Hannibal Hamlin, who was from the state of Maine, way up here in the, at the tippy top, Hamlin was much more vocally anti-slavery than Lincoln. Imagine if Hamlin had been retained on the ticket in 1864 and Hamlin had become president after Lincoln's assassination instead of Andrew Johnson. How different might American history look if Hannibal Hamlin had been the 17th president instead of Andrew Johnson? Boy, talk about one of the great what-ifs of American history. This is an 1860 electoral map showing the election in which Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. This is the red states. We don't have red states and blue states at this point, apparently. We have red states and green states and orange states and different shade of green states, I guess. The red states are Lincoln states, the Republican. The green states, so of course, the Democratic Party splits in this election, and that is the kiss of death anytime you're trying to win a national election, because you have two candidates from the same party running against each other. They're going to siphon off votes from each other. All the Republicans are voting for Lincoln, but the Democrats are splitting and voting for other candidates. So Lincoln is the Republican in red. John C. Breckinridge, who had been vice president under James Buchanan and then later became a Confederate general, is green, who he ran as the Southern Democratic candidate. Stephen Douglas, who had run against Lincoln for the Senate in 1858, is the kind of, I don't know, what do you call that, hunter green or something, wins only Missouri and part of New Jersey. And then John C. Bell is kind of a third, or in this case, fourth party candidate, the Constitutional Union candidate, who basically says we should just leave everything the way it is. Hands off everything, wins Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So obviously Lincoln wins the presidency because he wins the Electoral College. He wins 40% of the electoral vote, of the popular vote, but he wins 59% of the electoral vote. So this is the election of 1860 right here that made Abraham Lincoln the 16th president of the United States. So, the election of Lincoln, a Republican, even though he's a Republican who has said time and time again, I have no intention of doing anything about slavery in the places where it already exists. Not only do I not intend to do that, I don't feel I legally and constitutionally can do that. As soon as Lincoln is elected, Southerners begin to feel that the only option they have to preserve what they view as their rights, and we all know what rights they're talking about, is to secede and to create a new country that will preserve their rights for them. We talk all the time about what is the Civil War all about. Well, in 1860 and 61, as these southern states are seceding, the secession commissioners who were writing the ordinances of secession told us what it was about. Republicans were avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions and to the peace and prosperity of the state of Alabama, according to Alabama. Texas said that Republicans were proclaiming the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men, irrespective of race and color, a doctrine at war with nature. According to Texas, northern states have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books. We're standing here in a library, books and pictures to servile insurrection, according to South. Anybody here from South Carolina by any chance? I had my 11th grade American history teacher said, every problem this country has ever had started in South Carolina. That's probably not true, but how many decades ago was that? And I still remember him saying that. I think he was half kidding. So that's what South Carolina had to say. For 20 years past, the abolitionists and their allies in the northern states have been engaged in constant efforts to subvert our institutions and to excite insurrection and servile war among us, according to Georgia. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition, or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work our ruin, according to Mississippi. Southern leaders told us in 1860 and 61 why they were seceding. They told us what the issues were. They told us what rights they were concerned about in their individual states. They were concerned that a Republican president, because all Republicans were, as they said, damned black Republicans, were going to come in and were going to abolish slavery. Even though Lincoln and the Republican Party said time and time again, we can't do that, it's not constitutional. Now, once the war starts, that all changes, because there are many measures in the Constitution that allow the president to do a lot of things during wartime, especially during an insurrection, that they can't do otherwise. Then we have this fun-looking fellow. This is Alexander Stephens from Georgia. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. Stephens took this argument one step further and basically told everybody what was wrong with the original Constitution that the Confederate Constitution fixed. The new Constitution, meaning the Confederate Constitution, has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution of African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split, the fire bell in the night, as Jefferson referred to it at one point. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact. But whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at that time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. The Vice President of the Confederate States of America. So now I'm going to start sort of transitioning over to John here. Just some very quick information about the amendments themselves. The 13th Amendment passed the Senate in April of 1864, passed the House of Representatives January 31st, 1865. Many of you probably saw the film Lincoln, I don't know what, 10, 11 years ago now, the Daniel Day-Lewis. That film is a dramatization of Lincoln's efforts to get the 13th Amendment passed through Congress so it can be sent to the states for ratification. And that was achieved on January 31st, 1865. I think it's great irony, in a good way, that Illinois was the first state to ratify, that of course being Lincoln's adopted home state. Georgia, Alexander Stephens' home state no less, became the final state that needed to ratify. Of course, 3/5 need to ratify for something to become part of the Constitution, and it became officially part of the Constitution in December of 1865. 14th Amendment, the big one, passed the House June of 1866, passed the Senate also in June. This is, and again, I'm sure John's going to get into some of this, so I won't belabor the point, but the state legislatures in all of the former Confederate states simply refused to ratify it. So Congress responded with a law in March of 1867 that required former states to ratify the 14th Amendment before they could have representation in Congress. Sort of holding their feet to the fire there a little bit. Connecticut was the first state to ratify. Ohio, interestingly enough, ratified in January of 1867, but then rescinded it a year later when Democrats took over the state house in Ohio. And they didn't get around to formally re-ratifying it in Ohio until March of 2003. So that's, surprising. New Jersey and Oregon also rescinded, of course, later did eventually ratify. Became formally part of the Constitution in July of 1868. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, passed by the House in February of 1869, passed the Senate the very next day, February 26th of 69. Nevada, the first state to ratify. Iowa, the last state needed to achieve the 3/5, and it became part of the Constitution in March of 1870. And then I'll finish with this quote from Eric Foner that talks about not only the 15th Amendment, but just how precarious some of these rights in this Constitution of ours are. The 15th Amendment is a remarkable accomplishment, given that slavery was such a dominant institution before the Civil War. But the history of the 15th Amendment also shows that rights can never be taken for granted. Things can be achieved and things can be taken away. And with that, I will step aside.
There's an old Irish proverb that goes something like, time cannot erase history. And, this is why it's worth studying this stuff. Not because we want to say, how terrible the United States is. In fact, the really fascinating thing about this is that the U.S. Constitution and the amendments to the U.S. Constitution represent this incredible wager on the idea of popular government. I mean, this is why Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is so powerful and so moving. Now we are engaged in a great civil war to see whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And And of course, he was saying, too, that we were sort of morally obligated to carry forth the work that the soldiers had done at Gettysburg. But he understood exactly what it was about. And I mean, this is, I think Todd made a great point, too. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, Civil War wasn't about slavery, it's about states' rights, which is true in one way and false in another way more important way. I mean, it's about one particular state's right. But the slave power in the era between the Constitution of 1787 and the Civil War was not a sort of passive, resident of the United States. First of all, slavery and cotton production was on the move. Cotton is soil destroying in the same way that tobacco is. Any of you, like I spent years living in Maryland, and this is why they have to do field rotation in Maryland, because tobacco exhausts the soil. Cotton exhausts the soil in the same way, and cotton was moving west. So by 1820, a third of the cotton produced in the United States was being produced west of Georgia. It was moving into Mississippi, Alabama, it was moving into Texas. By 1860, that proportion was 3/4. So cotton is moving west, and cotton production needs slave labor in the sort of theory of how this is going to be organized. And so this is why it was a big deal, right? Sometimes you'll also hear people say, and people even said at the time, well, slavery was withering away. That's not true. The maximum slave population in the United States was 1860. Slavery was at its height, and it was going to keep going if something didn't change. And this is why it was a big deal for the slave owners, for the slave producers, to be able to expand into these new states below the Northwest Territory. So 1787, the Northwest Territory Act is passed, which precludes slavery from what would become the Western Reserve, from the areas north of the Ohio River. So the slave owners are terrified that the Northerners are going to come and eliminate slavery. They had some reason. There's not totally no reason why this was the case, but it was also, they made much more of it. So in the course of the 1830s, laws were passed in the South such that you were not allowed to advocate for slave emancipation. You were not allowed to use the words. You were not allowed to say it. You could be arrested for doing it, which is a straight up violation of the First Amendment. I mean, there's just no state of the world in which, to assert that that's not a violation of the First Amendment is really to do violence to language. I mean, there's just no way you could read the First Amendment without. But, and this is the key thing here, there's sort of impulses within the sort of slave system which cause people which change people's views or which shape the way that people interpret the Constitution. In the same way, Southern legislators wanted to pass legislation debarring northern states from illegalizing slavery. So they wanted to make it so that the northern states could also not be free states. It wasn't just like, okay, we'll have slavery down here and you don't have it up there. Like, they wanted to spread it. And they really view, one of the reasons why the limitations on free speech were passed was because the idea was it violates our right to property. Because the slaves are our property, if you're coming out and saying and being for emancipation, then you're basically trying to steal our property from us, which is grim. The key moment in the sort of early legal history of slavery, or one of them, is the Dred Scott case from 1858. Dred Scott was a slave who belonged to a guy who I believe lived in Missouri, but in any case, he was taken up into Illinois, which was a free state, and then taken back down. The guy died. He then was owned by the guy's wife, and he then sued in state court, saying that he had been in a free state, and the fact that he had been in a free state, that meant that he was actually free. Now, of course, this, there's a number of problems with this legally, so to speak, not the least of which being the Fugitive Slave Act, which, if you want to talk about reasons why Northerners were opposed to slavery, a big one was the Fugitive Slave Act, because it meant that a slave owner could come north and compel law enforcement in the northern locality to assist them in recovering someone who is a slave without necessarily having to provide much in terms of proof that that was the case, right? So, imagine, there's slavery now and from some other country, and they can come here and force the police chief of Mentor to start, helping them do that. And a lot of Northerners thought, that sucks. I mean, that's terrible. Anyway, so the case works its way to the Supreme Court. Dred Scott loses 7-2, I think, is the final count. The decision is written by Roger B. Taney. Sometimes it's pronounced both ways, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who wrote, "The words people of the United States and citizen are synonymous terms and mean the same thing. They both describe the political body who, according to our Republican institutions, form the sovereignty and who hold power to conduct the government through their representatives. They are what we familiarly call the sovereign people, and every citizen is one of these people and a constituent member of the sovereignty. The question before us is whether the class of persons described in this plea abatement compose a portion of this people and are constituent members of the sovereignty. We think they are not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. On the contrary, they were at that time considered as a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race, and whether emancipated or not, yet remained subject to their authority and had no rights or privileges, but such as those who held the power and the government might choose to grant them. It is difficult to conceive by what magic or the mere surcease or renunciation of interest in a subject of property by an individual possessing that interest can alter the essential character of that property with respect to persons and communities unconnected with such a renunciation, i.e., because slaves have been property, you cannot convert a property into a citizen. Taney was basically arguing, the substance of his decision is that blacks, slaves, whether they were free blacks or slaves, had no rights that a white man was obligated to take account of. He then argued that the founders, that this is what they had meant. As a matter of fact, so the term citizen turns up, I think, about 10 times in the original Constitution of 1787, but is defined 0 times. The founders provided no definition of what a citizen is, or really what citizens' rights are. In fact, that sort of came later, interestingly enough. Basically, he argued on the basis of no evidence whatsoever that, first of all, they weren't really serious in the Declaration of Independence, or that was the idea of everybody being equals. Obviously, everybody's not equal. There's a certain sense in which this is true, right? We're all different, but we're all equal in the sense of we have the same moral equality. As persons, we have the same sort of moral standing. So as such, we, according to our system, we get the same rights. And the same way with, when they said in the preamble of the Constitution, we the people, Taney said, what they meant was we the white male people. And for him, it was so obvious that he didn't feel like he had to present any historical substance for this, or historical foundation for this. Now, there's a sense in which, certainly, as Todd was mentioning, there were plenty of slave owners among the people at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. But the idea that it was self-evident that black people, that slaves, were a different class of entity from white male human beings, that's a much more complicated proposition, and one that I think if you read the positions of the people who were at that convention, read what Hamilton has to say about it, read what Elbridge Gerry has to say about it, it's much more complicated. And to a great extent, the 3/5 compromise, for a start, was put in place by people who thought it was a bad idea. The 3/5 compromise was basically an idea or a sort of way of getting the Southerners to come into the whole thing, because the South, the vast majority of slaves were in the South. The vast majority of the population of the country, or a large proportion of it, a much larger proportion of the white population, was in the North. So the 3/5 compromise really has this very profound effect on American politics. Look at the first presidents of the United States. George Washington from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, Madison from Virginia, John Adams, he was from Massachusetts, but But you see a series of Virginians, a series of Southerners, and the way that these Southerners maintain power, the way that the Southerners maintain power in the Congress is because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. As a matter of fact, I think it was Elbridge Gerry who said, well, if the Southerners get to count their slaves, then we get to count our horses and cows, right? Because if you're going to assert that they're the same thing, right? One of the, Justice McLean, one of the dissenters wrote, in the argument, it was said that colored citizen would not be an agreeable member of society. This is more a matter of taste than of law. Several of the states have admitted persons of color to the right of suffrage, and in this view have recognized them as citizens. And this has been done in the slave as well as in the free states. On the question of citizenship, it must be admitted that we have not been very fastidious. Under the late treaty with Mexico, we have made citizens of all grades, combinations, and colors. The same was done with the admission of Louisiana and Florida. No one ever doubted, and no court ever held, that people of these territories did not become citizens under the treaty. They have exercised the rights of citizens without being naturalized under the acts of Congress. So what he was saying was, Taney's ruling is just obviously inconsistent. He went on, and also the other dissenter went on to point out that, in fact, Taney's reading of the legal history was also inconsistent, and that it wasn't clear that blacks had systematically and in every case been treated as purely property and not also as people. Citizens having rights. So, in the wake of the Civil War, after the Confederacy surrenders, there's a sort of period of unclarity about what's going to happen. So Lincoln is assassinated almost immediately, and he is replaced by Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Tennessee slaveholder, hadn't owned a huge number of slaves, but he was a slaveholder and somebody who was very committed to the institution of slavery. So there's a sort of process of decision that goes on about what's going to happen in the southern states, right? And one of the things that happens is the southern sort of representatives of southern states come to the government and they're like, well, okay, yeah, you guys won, right? Fair enough. But like, okay, so we're just going to go, we get to keep slavery, right? Like we're and Johnson's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that's, we can work with that. And he allows the sort of setting up of a series of Reconstruction governments in southern states that basically don't do anything to advance the elimination of the system of slavery. What follows is a year of, among other things, really severe acts of violence. In Memphis in May 1866, there's a riot that breaks out between white residents and black Union soldiers who'd recently been mustered out. 46 black people are killed, 2 white people. About 100 people are injured. About $100,000 of property damage in 1866 dollars, which is probably a lot more. And by 1870, 75% of the black population of Memphis had been chased basically out of the city. New Orleans, in July, there was another outbreak of violence between a white mob and black citizens. And partly the sort of operative cause here, or the thing that caused that to break out, was a convention that had been called to discuss the creation of what were called black codes. So after the 13th Amendment was passed, 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, by the way, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Right, so no slavery, and Congress can make laws to enforce this. So once again, this is very different than the Bill of Rights, in which they start out, Congress shall make no law. What this saying is, Congress can make a law. So when this is passed, what the southern states then try and do, and Mississippi and Louisiana led the way, was create what are called black codes. And what they did was, they said all black men, the one in Mississippi is the sort of emblematic one, all black men in January have to sign a labor contract with the white man. If they do not, they can be arrested for vagrancy. They may have to pay a fine, or they may be convicted of vagrancy. And what happens if you're convicted duly of a crime? Then slavery becomes okay again. Basically, what happens is the southern states are then trying to recreate the slave institutions in other ways. So there's a kind of larger point here that's worth thinking about, and it's this, that just because the Civil War, and there's a point in the Civil War documentary where the historian Barbara Fields is talking about the sort of the heritage of the Civil War, and the point that she makes is, if we look at the Civil War, there's an argument to be made that it's not over and that it could still be lost, right? And the point to be made here is that the sort of degradation of black people didn't go away just because the Union won the Civil War. You can point to attempts that go on and on and on to try and recreate these relationships of subordination. And it goes on sort of particularly powerful in the 1860s. So in 1866, then they pass another piece of what's called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. While they're doing this, the movement has started for another amendment, the 14th Amendment. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is essentially meant to reaffirm the rights which are now extended by the Constitution to the formerly enslaved people. And it's a process. So one sort of interesting thing that goes on is there's Charles Sumner, the representative from Massachusetts, is very sort of avidly promoting this idea. And he gives a speech that goes on for 2 days. Sumner was famous for this. And I mean, I'm always amazed by Hamilton. Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 gives a 5-hour-long speech. But he had nothing on Charles Sumner. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 essentially makes it so the black codes won't work anymore. The 14th Amendment, and this is really one of the most interesting, so there's 3 sections of the 14th Amendment, or 4, I guess, if you count the Congress has the power to make the laws. But sections 2 and 3, there's almost no jurisprudence on, because those mostly had to do with the consequences of the Civil War, like who could be a public official and whatever. And those, fair enough, those are important things, right? Like you don't want people who've been engaged in a traitorous rebellion to then be part of the government. By the way, too, so what happens in 1866 is that it becomes clear to the Republicans in Congress that Andrew Johnson is not really on their side. And to attempt to address this, they impeach him. He is impeached by his own party, and he comes within 1 vote of actually losing the Senate trial. He's impeached by the leaders of the impeachment process. One of them is John Armour Bingham, the Ohio senator, who also, or representative, John Armour Bingham had been on the 3-lawyer prosecution team that prosecuted the people who tried to assassinate, the people who assassinated Lincoln tried to assassinate Seward. But Bingham is a very intense guy. They had to override Andrew Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And Bingham voted to sustain the veto because he thought that it didn't go far enough. And so he starts working on the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment, Section 1 bears very close reading because it's key to what's going on then, it's key to what's going on now. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. Okay, so that resolves Tanya's blacks aren't really citizens. If you were born in this country or you were naturalized, you are a citizen. So whatever rights citizens get, and it's still unclear exactly what those are, but you get them. You get them by birthright. Birthright citizenship is key, and I can tell you as the child of we're all mostly here probably down the line from immigrants. My father's family, my mother's family came in the 1720s. My father's family came in the 1840s from Ireland, not because of the famine, but because they just thought the economic prospects were better in the U.S. The part of Ireland they were from was not terribly badly hit by the famine, but then everyone, they were naturalized, and everyone since then, you get this great privilege by being born in this country. You get the right of citizenship in the United States, and believe me, lots of people want it. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any persons of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, so that's the due process clause. And you'll notice that the language there is exactly the same as it is, or almost exactly, as the Fifth Amendment. And that was the point. As a matter of fact, after this, John Armour Bingham was sort of, people were like, well, this is a very radical thing that you've managed to put in the Constitution. John Armour Bingham said, all the language that's in this is in the Constitution, which is not really true. But it's true about that. I mean, he was very, he really did want to model it on what was there because he wanted to make sure that people understood that what he was doing was extending, emphasizing truths that were already there in the extant documents running the country. Nor deny to any persons within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is possibly the most crucial, the most contentious piece of the Constitution, with the possible exception of not with the exception of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is pretty heavily, it's pretty thoroughly, it's sui decisis, it's decided law. Like the Supreme Court has basically indicated that they've decided what it is and they're just going to let it lie. 14th Amendment, Samuel Alito said, and also Clarence Thomas, so Roe was decided on the basis of an implied right that's contained in this, in what's called substantive due process, not equal protection, but due process. And basically, substantive due process is very complicated, it's very fraught area of law. Alito has basically said that he thinks that they should reconsider all the cases that have been decided on the basis of substantive due process, which includes the right to birth control, the right to... It's debatable about interracial marriage. Interracial marriage is Loving v. Virginia. That was, if you read Loving closely, it's actually decided on, it's decided more on equal protection than it is on substantive due process. But a lot of things, if free access to birth control goes away, things really change in the United States. You may think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a thing. But equal protection, is an absolutely key part of the Constitution, because it basically says if one group has certain rights under the law, then everybody's got to have them too. You can't say this group can have it, this group can't. And this is what it is fully consonant with the fundamental documents of the country. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I love that line because, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We don't have to provide any proof. We don't have to prove it. It's just obvious that all men are created equal morally, right? So I can't dunk a basketball and LeBron James can. But we're morally equal. He just gets paid better. Because the whole dunking the basketball thing, which I'm going to try and not be upset about. The 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, and this gets into another sort of really interesting part of American law. I'm going to, once again, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Who does this enfranchise? Nobody. Who does the Constitution enfranchise? Nobody. The Constitution does not say that anybody gets the vote. As a matter of fact, the only place where it comes up is in Article 1, where it said that the members of the representatives of the House of Representatives will be elected by the people of the United States. It doesn't say which people. But it specifies that you have to be eligible to vote in the election for the most numerous legislative body in your state in order to be eligible to vote. So this is one of those things where it falls to the states. This is really, according to the Constitution, the states get to decide who votes. What the 15th Amendment says is not black people get the vote. What the 15th Amendment says is if other people get the vote, black people can't be denied it just on the basis of being black or having been slaves. Now, you can look at this and say, well, that's really great. And it is. Except that if you're a Southerner, if you're in one of these slave states, and not only there, by the way, you might find some other ways to prevent people from voting, like literacy tests or poll taxes. As a matter of fact, they had a whole other amendment that deals with the whole poll tax thing. Because, what we don't want is, literacy is not, you could sort of look at it on the face and be like, well, we want people to be literate. Sure, we do, right? But the question is, are you capable intellectually of making a sort of reasoned decision about how the country should be run? And do you have a skin in the game, which as an adult person in this country, irrespective of race or of gender, let's just throw that one out there, you have you fall into this group. And by the way, this is a really interesting feature of the whole thing. So when the 15th Amendment is being debated, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony have started this organization to help militate for black suffrage. Why did they do this? Because it occurred to them that if you were going to give black people suffrage, why not women's suffrage? Well, you might ask. In the debates about the 15th Amendment, the 15th Amendment is actually fairly narrow and becomes even narrower as the courts start getting with it after 1870. But in the debates, some people say, well, we should put more sort of universalistic language in this, right? We should make it clear everyone gets a vote. And that gets sort of pushed aside. Why? Because the men in the Congress, and not only there, let's just acknowledge what we're all about, are afraid that if they have more expansive, more universalistic language, it'll mean that they have to end up enfranchising women too. And they really don't want to do that. And it's weird, like the kind of parallel arguments that you see for this. So the argument against Negro suffrage, to use, Negro is obviously an inappropriate term in the modern world, but that's how they talked about it then, was, God created them and made them deficient. Everyone acknowledges that they're deficient, so they shouldn't have the vote. So this whole process is about getting past that bad idea. But then when the women's suffrage thing comes up, what happens? All these guys are like, well, God really meant for women to be, secondary. They should be, taking care of the house. There's what's called the law of coverture, which specified it was that if you're a woman and you're married, your property is really your husband's property. And any work that you do in the context of the domestic environment belongs to your husband, is part of your husband's produce. So the father, the leading male in whatever arrangement, family arrangement, is the sort of leader and should do all the voting. This now strikes us as a pretty ridiculous idea. And it's funny too that, sometimes you'll hear it's hard to sort of assert it consistently because it's so ridiculous. It's so, for the record, and this is obvious, but just to sort of bring science in for a moment, there is absolutely no evidence whatever, based on like valid science, that there's any difference in capacities in any degree. Race is a myth, really it is, just in terms of scientifically identifiable characteristics. And the same way between the genders, between the sexes, there's no difference. Women aren't smarter than men, men aren't smarter than women. Women who've done natural childbirth have apparently a slightly higher pain tolerance. If you watch the Mythbusters episode where they have them, I believe it. The woman who'd done natural childbirth sticks her hand in a bucket of ice-filled water, and she gets to the end of 3 minutes, she's like, oh yeah, that's fine. But really, there is no, what's happened with these amendments is a sort of acknowledgement of what we know to be the case, of what we subsequently know to be the case scientifically. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of human dignity There just is no difference. I mean, there's no, and this in a way gets back to that sort of cartoon that I showed at the beginning, right? Basically, we needed these amendments at the time because we're engaged in a fight to sort of redeem the best instincts of the Constitution, to redeem the best instincts of the documents on which the country is based, right? But they really just recapitulate things that if you read closely and consistently in the Constitution of 1787 and the Bill of Rights are already there. With the following one exception, that now the state, the federal government, can make laws compelling conformity with these principles. And also, and I mean, another sort of part of it is, one of the questions was, well, does the 14th Amendment cover private people? Or is it just, if the state of Georgia is making a law such that X is the case, that's one thing, but does this apply to public services like, who can walk on which side of the street, or who can go to the theater, or who can ride in trains? According to Bingham, it did. According to the framers of the 14th Amendment, it did. But this is sort of the kind of point at which I will finish. So in the 1870s, the courts start narrowing the interpretations of these amendments. There's a case in 1872, Blyeu versus United States. Two white guys in Kentucky had axe murdered a family of 4 black people. They were, the local DA sent it up to federal court. And the reason was because black people under the laws in Kentucky at that time could not serve as witnesses. So they were convicted, sentenced to death. They appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court overturned their conviction. And the argument was, and this is one of the most bizarrely tortured pieces of legal reasoning you're ever going to find, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, whose name was Strong, declared that only parties to the case, the defendants and the government, were affected, not potential black witnesses and not the murder victims, their families. It will not be thought, Strong wrote, that Congress intended to give to the federal courts jurisdiction over all cases, both civil and criminal. And so the conviction was overturned. Joseph P. Bradley, who was a Justice of the Supreme Court and wrote a dissenting opinion, wrote, "To refuse to allow the whole class of community to give evidence in court, Bradley declared the court had adopted a view of the law too narrow, too technical, and too forgetful of the liberal objects it had in view. All blacks were affected by the race's inability to testify, and therefore removal to federal court was entirely proper. The decision," he warned, "gave unrestricted, quote, unrestricted license and impunity to vindictive outlaws and felons to slay black people at will," which is true, sadly enough. So, this is a moment that we should maybe think about. Like, once again, this is, we look at the Civil War and we're like, okay, we fixed those problems. But the courts continue to interpret things in a way that, pre-war racism keeps coming back like a bad penny. But the big one, and the one that's worth remembering, is Plessy V Ferguson from 1896. A fellow named Homer Adolph Plessy, who was African American, tried to ride he wanted to ride the train in Louisiana. They had racially segregated train cars. The black car was full, I think, and he wanted to ride on the white car, and he was arrested. He was 7/8 Caucasian, by the way. He was almost, one of the points that came up in Plessy v. Ferguson is, like, it's ridiculous to forbid black people, because a lot of times you can't tell who's what. But the Supreme Court basically upheld Plessy's conviction, arguing that as long as the state provided separate but equal facilities, that it was okay. This became the law of the land and was not really convincingly booted out of American jurisprudence until Brown v. Board of Education in the 1950s, in which they ruled that separate is inherently unequal. And, actual practice would have proved this. I mean, if you looked at the sort of facilities that were provided to blacks as opposed to the facilities provided for white. It wasn't, I mean, it was seldom of a common quality, but, and this is the key thing, so John Marshall Harlan, I'm going to give a talk next year about John Marshall Harlan. He was often referred to as the great dissenter. He was from Kentucky. He had been a slave owner, I think, before the war. He served on the Union side, but he said at one point when they were considering the Emancipation Proclamation that he would resign his commission if the Emancipation Proclamation were enacted. But over the course of the years, in the the rest of the war and the subsequent years, he had a very profound change of heart by the 1890s, and he wrote in his dissent. And I think the reading John Marshall Harlan's dissent in Plessy is one of the more fascinating ways you can study American history. Now he starts out. I mean, this isn't exactly the start, but the passage I'm going to read somewhat unprepossessingly with the following line. The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth, and in power. So, I doubt not, it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage and holds fast the principles of constitutional liberty. Okay, that's not so great. I mean, we've all read worse, but that doesn't make that great. Okay, but then he continues, and this is where we should really, where we really can get with what Harlan has to say. But in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind, and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer to the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings, by the way. This is still 23 years before the 19th Amendment gives women suffrage, although there were some states in which women did have suffrage at this point. But anyway, moving on. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when his civil rights, as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land, are involved. It is therefore to be regretted that this high tribunal, the final expositor of the fundamental law of the land, has reached the conclusion that it is competent for a state to regulate the enjoyment by citizens of their civil rights solely on the basis of race. In my opinion, the judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case. Like he saw exactly in what line of reasoning he was working. It was adjudged in that case that the descendants of African Americans who were imported into this country and sold as slaves were not included nor intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution and could not claim any of the rights and privileges which that instrument provided for and secured to citizens of the United States. That at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, they were considered as subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race and, whether emancipated or not, yet remained subject to their authority and had no rights or privileges but such as those who held power and the government might choose to grant them. The recent amendments to the Constitution, it was supposed, had eradicated these principles from our institutions, but it seems that we have yet in some of the states a dominant race, a superior class of citizens, which assumes to regulate the enjoyment of civil rights common to all citizens upon the basis of race. The present decision, it may well be apprehended, will not only stimulate aggressions, more or less brutal and irritating, upon the admitted rights of colored citizens, but it will encourage the belief that it is possible by means of state enactments to defeat the beneficent purposes which the people of the United States had in view when they adopted the recent amendments to the Constitution, by one of which the blacks of this country were made citizens of the United States and of the states in which they respectively reside, and whose privileges and immunities as citizens the states are forbidden to abridge. 60 millions of whites are in no danger from the presence here of 8 million blacks. The destinies of the two races in this country are indissolubly linked together, and the interests of both require that the common government of all shall not permit the seeds of race hate to be planted under the sanction of law. What can more certainly arouse race hate? What can more certainly create and perpetuate a feeling of distrust between these races than state enactments, which, in fact, proceed on the ground that colored citizens are so inferior and degraded that they cannot be allowed to sit in public coaches occupied by white citizens. That, as all will admit, is the real meaning of such legislation as was enacted in Louisiana. So what he says, clearly the state of Louisiana wasn't saying, well, black people would prefer to be around black people and white people around. What state of Louisiana is saying is, we need to protect the white people from the, it's clear that the basis of this law is creating one race is up here and another race is down here. And so, the point he's really trying to get across is that this is a sort of failure to acknowledge. I mean, it's not even a failure to understand. It's a failure to acknowledge what was clearly the intent of the people who had written the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And this problem continues to this day. I will just note that Brown v. Board of Education doesn't get decided until, I believe, 1954. There's another case, which I think is Atkins, am I remembering? It's Jones v. Atkins, which is 1968, maybe, where, for a long time, there would be these sort of covenants that would keep black people from buying houses in non-black areas. I think I had this. There it is. U.S. Code, Article 42 of the U.S. Code, Section 1982, all citizens of the United States. This was adopted in 1926, and this is the basis that Atkins, I think it's 26, but this is the basis on which Atkins is decided. But just to sort of finish up, women don't get the full franchise till 1919. The 24th Amendment, getting rid of poll taxes, among other things, doesn't get passed until 1964. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, once again, reaffirms essentially rights that should be discernible in the Constitution prior to that point. Also, one of the interesting things about the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s is that, and this I'll just sort of leave you with, we'll talk about this more in the next year's lectures on the Supreme Court. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s are based on a relatively tendentious reading of the Interstate Commerce Clause. It's not, you would think, you would look at it and be like, wow, equal rights, that's got to be like the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? No. The argument basically went, if I recall correctly, that if an interstate trucker who is black was making a delivery in the South and couldn't find a hotel that would allow him to stay because he was black, that amounted to a restraint of trade. And if you want to really go down a rabbit hole, start looking at the jurisprudence surrounding the Interstate Commerce Clause, because it's really, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution is really, it's been made to support a whole bunch of things, but that's the kind of, this I really want to leave you with. This is a sort of interesting thing about the Constitution as a document. And Todd alluded to this earlier. It's meant to be a living document. So there's something to be said for the sort of constructionist idea that we want to look back at what the framers thought. But let's seriously look at it. Let's not just, so often, instead of like looking at what the framers thought or intended, what people do is put their own sort of spin on what the framers thought or intended. And the perfect case of this is the jurisprudence that follows the Civil War amendments. The judges, if you look at the jurisprudence in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, up in the first decades of the 20th century, judges are basically reading those amendments and saying, well, they really didn't, they meant this much narrower thing, which is not really true and easily debunkable, but that's what we have as a living document. I mean, this is why the Constitution has survived so long, and may it survive another 200 years. I mean, Winston Churchill is supposed to have said, he probably didn't, but it's worth noting anyway, that the democracy is the worst system of government known to man, except for all the other ones. I mean, yeah, that, you look at the Constitution, it's like, well, it's got this problem, that problem, the other one. That's fine, but I think it's a really better take on putting together a civilized society than I've lived all over and I've seen some other systems and I like ours. Anyway, yeah, thanks for coming out. This is, I will take questions. We will both take questions if you would like. Feel free. But this is, you know, I've had so much fun putting together these lectures, and I've just learned so much. And it really like, you read some of these things like John Marshall Harlan's Dissent, and you think, God, we are really pretty great. You know, if you know, people like express those kind of humane sentiments, like it's a pretty moving thing to read. So thanks for joining us as we did it, and if people have questions, we're here for that too.